what I would say is that there aren't any kind of easy answers to how you should find a way of making money, and certainly in the current situation, a bit of entrepreneurialism is required of everybody. Um, but don't allow it to become your to become an ideology, right? Because it's a thing you do in order to get by, and you keep an eye on the bigger picture, if you can. And if when it comes to it, the numbers are in on the gambling, and while political gambling is one where the numbers are slightly better than other forms of gambling, it's very unlikely uh, to be a stable source of income. The general estimate is about 3% of gamblers, and that's among 3% of gamblers who gamble on things that uh, give you a chance to be profitable, like horses, like football, etc. Um, and you gotta keep that in your mind. Do you think that you're one of those 3%? And even if you are among that 3%, can you maintain it when you are faced with um, continual incentives to gamble on other things? How disciplined are you really in your engagement with it? If you're in it already, keep records and work out what you're doing. That's what all the successful ones tell me. And be honest with yourself. If it's not working, do something different. Um, and uh, and as a general piece of advice, I would steer clear.
Gambling sits at the intersection of money, politics, and identity in ways simply didn't a generation ago. And Gen Z is living inside that shift more than anyone else. As a young person myself, navigating the same economic pressures many audiences faces, housing crisis, stagnant wages, the feeling of conventional routes of wealth closing, I thought it was important to get someone who could speak to these ideas and try to figure out how we can find a way through them. Dr. Anthony Pickles has spent his career building the anthropological framework to explain exactly why that's happening and what it reveals about societies producing those phenomena. This conversation is an attempt to give that framework to the people who need it most. Dr. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
So let's start with kind of like the studies that I kind of mentioned. So you spent years studying people who gamble when they have almost nothing. What did that teach you about human nature that you didn't learn or you couldn't have learned any other way?
Um, well, it's a great question. I think it's a big question as well. I think that you're at the end. To put it in perspective, there are lots of people out there who do not gamble. There's lots of people who live in societies where gambling happens and they don't participate in gambling. There are also sort of cultures and societies where gambling was not part of what people did. Often those people were kind of on the margins of capitalism or other kind of larger systems of economy, and uh, and therefore I was always really interested in people who gamble who didn't gamble before, to tell us a little bit about what is really human nature and what isn't human nature, and what's just kind of economic and cultural circumstances. And so I think, so the short answer to that question is that I don't think there is a human nature to gamble, like to think about things in gambling terms, but that gambling is so important to the way that our present society, in the in the larger kind of global sense, um, uh, how it thinks about itself, that it thinks about gambling as being natural. So the big kind of deceit in all of this is the idea that gambling is part of human nature and part of the way that humans have to think about the world. But it isn't, but it feels natural, and that's because it is at the absolute core of how we understand how we're supposed to interact with each other on a kind of normal and everyday kind of basis. And so the people who I worked with previously, who didn't gamble and then picked up gambling during colonial period when money came along, etc. Those people uh, explicitly were attempting to kind of figure out and understand a new economic system that they were coming to grips with. And so gambling tells us that it's human nature to try and find a way to play, and through that play think about the wider circumstances they live in and how they can kind of be successful within it.
I think it's yeah, I think it's fascinating that yes, you can look at it both ways. Where it is about individuals and human beings and how they kind of choose to kind of alchemize their environment, but it also says a lot about the society that they live in. So I think it's very interesting to look at the study that you did, the fieldwork study you did in Papua New Guinea, or currently doing ongoing. Could you talk to me about like that the research and kind of like what started you on that indigenous mathematic path? And can you tell me more about this and how the mathematics lead you to gambling?
Yes, so Papua New Guinea is a super interesting place, but it's not a place that I was super interested in before I started. So I did an undergraduate, and it was in anthropology, uh, but I never studied anything to do with numbers or things. And I was kind of a maths geek at school. And although I never pursued it for A level, I all did kind of humanities subjects. I was just kind of really driven to try and understand the way that the world works. And so I thought that the best way to do that would be to do kind of human oriented subjects. And so, but I had a little, I've got a little soft spot for maths in it. And so it kind of occurred to me that I had done no mathematics. I'd never learned anything about the way that maths is done differently in different places. And it sounds kind of silly to say that, oh, maths is different. There's a universality to the way that numbers work, right? But our base numbers, the numbers that we consider to be important, the way that we kind of conceptualize the maths that we do, like the fact that we count bones and things as individual units rather than as kind of parts of a wider totality, like that kind of larger scaffolding that goes around mathematics that I learned about after I started looking into it. That obviously makes a huge difference to the way that people think about the world, because there's very little that's more fundamental to us than the way that we count, right? And so um, I sort of decided I wanted to do this working in a cocktail bar. I was going to do a master's. I wanted to go to Iraq. That was not looking good by that point, and worse over that summer. And so I went to my supervisor and I said, I want to do something on maths. And he he put me sent me towards a couple of books, one of which was based in Papua New Guinea, and one of the, and was by a man called a brilliant man called Yadra Mimica, called Intimations of Infinity, that was all about how people think with number differently in Papua New Guinea. Amazing, written in 1988. Definitely not what I would find in Papua New Guinea again. So it became really clear to me then that I needed to do one of two things to make it kind of contemporary and relevant, which is find a place where maths, indigenous mathematics, and for want of a better term, Western mathematics meet. And there was kind of two obvious options for that. One of which was maths education in schools, and the other thing I found out in the time whilst I was looking for ways that people engage with mathematics in Papua New Guinea is through gambling. And I was 22 or 23, and the idea of sitting in a classroom with kids, which is not quite as appealing as sitting underneath houses playing cards with random people.
And okay, tell me more about that kind of study then, or kind of like what you found when you started sitting underneath the kind of houses playing cards. How did gambling function differently to what we view of it as in the West?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are kind of structural similarities, and then there are kind of sociocultural, not well, differences and sociocultural differences. The big kind of structural difference is that so gambling is very often made illegal in situations of colonization or kind of politically fraught situations. Because if you think about it, gambling is a place where uh, people gather secretly, or people gather and get rowdy and get interested. So there's two kind of approaches you can take to that. One is you can allow it as a kind of release valve, or you can try and prevent it, because it potentially kind of disempowers you. Now, in a colonial situation, it's particularly important to suppress gambling, in part because those people, often, people of a different skin color, or people who don't have the same values as the colonizer, they are being given money for the first time. Or they're not giving it, they're working for wage work, or they're working for goods, etc. And that is a powerful way of kind of structuring your relationship between yourself, between you as colonizer and the colonized, right? So they have to work for you in order to get their money. Well, gambling doesn't, it messes up that flow, right? It redistributes goods amongst all different kinds of people. And it does it in a way that kind of allows people to negotiate with boundaries, and kind of different power structures in society, right? So um, in Papua New Guinea, you're talking about people who, young people working as laborers, making money and wealth that kind of absolutely eclipsed and sort of overtook their kind of elders and forebears who did have control over society. So they needed to find, but those young men, they needed to get married, and they needed to be part of the world. So what did they do? They came back with chests full of goods, and then they would gamble them with the other people in the village, and they would somehow lose, right? And often they would lose the people who would then have power to give them permission to marry. And so these so gambling became, for people in Papua New Guinea, a way of kind of negotiating and playing with this new economy, and doing so in a way that allowed them to include other people, but also just to kind of explore what money does and what other kinds of valuable are doing. You've got to think that this is like really peripheral. These goods, these axe heads, these bush knives, this oil, this soap, all this stuff's new. Where is it coming from? How is it made? Why do these people who just came here have control over these things? And why do they insist on using this thing called money? And why do they insist on taking taxes from us in this thing called money that makes us have to then work for them, right? So it's massively confusing, and they're not really being given any kind of way of having any kind of equal stake in this system, right? And so people are trying to find ways of exploring exploring what's possible and how they can act in a way that allows them to be successful in this new kind of economy. So that's what was happening, but because it was illegal, it was happening secretly, underground, with games that were invented by Papua New Guineans, and then kind of adapted and had this kind of interesting genealogy into what we see today. So there's two, as I said at the beginning, there are two differences. One of them is kind of socio-cultural. That's what I'm talking about there. The other one is kind of structural, which is that there's no house edge to most of these games, right? I'm not a I've got no specific advantage because I own because I deal in the cards, right? And so as a result of that, it makes it possible for people to kind of um, have a more kind of fair distribution of the wins and losses across the populace. And then when gambling starts to come in Papua New Guinea, then you've got horse races, then you've got they call them pokies, they're slot machines, all of these things that have house edges that then make it possible to exploit this new interest that people have in gambling and turn it into the kind of reliable, uh, capital enhancing, extractive operation that it is in, in all places these days.
I think that point is very important because I think that's what initially drew me to this conversation was that your study in Papua New Guinea was very kind of like new and fresh and kind of almost prophetic in terms of what it led to what we see happening in the West. And I think that's what is so interesting to me because I feel like a generation is that is figuring out itself out is kind of coming to the same conclusion as they did in Papua New Guinea that you can change your environment simply by kind of using the system to kind of flip it around. But that system itself is corrupt. That system itself isn't built to kind of help you. And in your study, you talked about you kind of drew a line between what you found in Papua New Guinea's gambling systems and kind of apps like Polymarket or Kashi. Can you walk me through that for me, please?
Yeah, of course. My so I'm I'm interested, or I became a gambling person as a result of this, and now I can't escape it. And and what I found most interesting about the about gambling is the way that it puts a lot of things on the line, right? It puts money on the line, it puts reputation on the line, and it's a place where sort of society and its large, especially in Papua New Guinea, as I was talking about, society and its wider values are put in the game and become something that people can kind of play with as a way of understanding, right? So I'm really interested in places in parts of kind of gambling or parts of activity and economic activity in general that where the stakes are something that's locked into society as well, right? So I skipped now that I've got a family and it's not so easy for me to go to and from Papua New Guinea. I'm now working. I then skipped over to another place where I thought society is most at stake in the gambling situation. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that you would to look at political gambling, which is how I started this project before it became more about prediction markets, which are political gambling. I mean, that's a distinction without a difference, but they've been reframed, and I'm sure I'll get onto that. But the fact that politics, the most important thing that we do, the way we organize our society, is something that could be reimagined and thought through gambling, and that could be of some kind of benefit either to the individual doing it as a kind of mental exercise to make them kind of better politicians or better kind of uh, 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 rational decision makers, or and also at the same time that where politics itself can and should be thought of as a gamble, right? That to me, I think is puts more at stake in the gambling situation because it makes it more interesting in a way that I see, and it might be just my kind of internal logic, but I see it as akin or similar to the kind of frontier experience of gambling that I was working with in Papua New Guinea.
Mm. And let's get into some of the kind of ways that's being done. So, kind of like systems like Polymarket and Kashi, they present themselves as like forecasting tools, a way to kind of turn intelligence into like prediction almost. Is that truly what they are, or are they something different?
Um, they they are that on its face. Um, and it's important to recognize that political gambling has been around for a long time, but its sort of reception and its understanding and its kind of value to society has changed massively over that time. And those are kind of deliberate political projects. So the by creating a market, essentially a derivatives market for political outcomes, right? Where that market then kind of follows the apparent likelihood of things happen. Of course, you can never really know how whether it was good at predicting something, right? Because if there's if let's say let's take the 2016 election of Hillary Clinton, of not Hillary Clinton, then that was a kind of 10% chance at a likelihood outcome that Trump was going to win that election, right? So that's what the betting markets were saying at the time. And obviously Trump went ahead and won, right? So what's the prediction? Like, are the prediction markets, are the political gambling websites wrong because they said that? No, not by their own terms, because that 10% chance of it happening means that it happens 10% of the time, right? And so the favorite doesn't always win in the horses, just like it doesn't in politics. And so they're kind of unfalsifiable in terms of their kind of predictive capacity, and often the kind of smart money who are in it might be betting on the kind of longer odds outcomes happening. But the big picture is, yeah, they want to sell the idea that they have this kind of predictive capacity as a social good, because that social good enables them to facilitate gambling, and enables them to kind of sell what they're doing as something different from just any other kind of gambling on any other kind of sporting event. And of course, at the same time, we're looking at all these kind of prediction markets. They're also moving into other kinds of gambling and risky ventures at the same time. So it's sort of transparently the case that they really want the gambling. It's just quite useful to them to be able to say that they are predictive.
Yeah, and I want to get into the different ways they're kind of doing that culturally, socially, politically, like you've mentioned, and the kind of like the systems and how they're kind of changing the systems around to fit that kind of need. But for now, let's stick a little bit of the core framework of what really drew me to this conversation. So I think the central argument here is that gambling has become a symptom of a blocked mobility almost, like you spoke about in Papua New Guinea, like I've kind of realized in Gen Z, I feel like when conventional routes to finding and building a life close off, people turn to systems that compress time, kind of a place where you can change your wealth kind of in a possibility in a very short amount of time. And I think, that's all against the kind of the normal way of accumulating wealth over decades of hard work. You have these systems which kind of help that. You've argued that the working class and economically marginalized people use gambling to gain control over money flows in ways that they maybe couldn't. Can you kind of unpack that idea for me, linking back to that, what the central theme is, basically?
Yeah, and I should clarify, when I say that, I mean that they use it to attempt to do that. It doesn't mean that it's successful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, it's kind of a long and well established kind of reality that people who are in have lesser and more kind of sporadic access to wealth and the kind of trappings of a good life. The calculus around how they engage with risk changes, right? Because just being sensible isn't enough. And so I should is people, the idea of being of a kind of extended adolescence that reaches on into 20s and 30s and on, something I personally experienced as well. It's been going on for a while, but it is being the it's increasingly the case that young people, and young men in particular, because young men make up the vast majority of gamblers, are being given many more opportunities, and are having the ways that they can experience gambling in their lives presented to them in a myriad of different ways, and in ways that kind of blur the boundaries between normal finance and gambling. And that makes it sort of, that kind of failure of financial education means that people can engage with a kind of natural calculus that we've got less money, therefore I should probably just take more risk, right? They can engage with that, but it's more sophisticatedly run in a way that means that actually the likelihood that they're going to profit from it becomes less over time as well, because the financial uh understanding of the companies providing all these different forms of gambling and risky personal finance, day trading, retail trading, all those things, those uh they have a grasp over everything that you can't possibly attain and be successful with as a young person with that kind of asymmetry of information. I mean, there are rare cases, but they're rare for a reason.
Absolutely, I agree, and I think I personally relate to that sentiment because I'm from kind of like so I was born in Ghana. Like I came when I was very young. I'm from a kind of like a lower economic background kind of neighborhood, and I think that growing up in that environment, especially when you've got ambition, you kind of look at risk differently. That the identity you have towards risk changes because you understand that in order to get to where you're going, you have to take that risk, and you have to be able to kind of change your situation in a way, and so. I mean, I looked at it as like, okay, I'm going to take loads of time to kind of educate myself and work hard. But I think a lot of my other friends was like, okay, we got to find different ways, whether that's illegal ways or whether that's like gambling. It's like just finding ways to kind of change the environment. And I think that a society that creates those kind of choices, it's a society that's not understanding it's kind of like citizens or like the pressure is put on in citizens. And I think that's very interesting too. And I feel like this is kind of spreading. It's a way that's spreading from my neighborhood and my environment to Gen Z at large. Do you think the kind of rise in gambling rates is kind of due to Gen Z's inability to make it up the housing ladder or like, the kind of stagnant wages? What do you think explains the kind of like prevalence of gambling in Gen Z right now, you think?
Yeah, I mean it that's half the story for sure. It's quite it's easily the case that people are kind of struggling and see that that it's tilted in a way that the system is tilted, especially with like that housing market, etc., in a way that makes it essentially impossible, and their concerns about it to be ignored. But there are two other aspects to this that I want to kind of bring in. One is that this is kind of that that people promote this way of thinking, this way of kind of risk-taking approach to life, because it's generally unthreatening to the powers that have control. Right? You take a load of risks. You end up on the scrap heap, so do 15 of your friends. One person makes it, makes a bunch of money, but that person ends up being a capitalist. The rest of you end up working for that guy or someone else, right? So there's no it. The idea that we would think that the idea that we should be making more risky decisions is actually a benefit to capitalism as a whole, right? And so it it's helpful to push that idea, make it seem natural, as I was saying before, but also to kind of um, school citizens in that the only way that you can respond and react to that level of uncertainty is by going the extra mile, running the extra yard, doing the um, turning every moment of leisure into a side hustle, right? Those things serve capitalism at the same time, and so it we so pushing gambling and pushing these forms of riskier finances onto younger people at the same time is both revenue generating in itself, but also a process of educating people away from organizing, away from demanding accountability of their politicians, and the way that the economy is organized, and to a kind of uh, I have to be smarter than you individualism, and I'll find and a distrust, a distrust of expertise in a way that that sets people on a path to kind of self um into a kind of, I don't want to use the word devious, but like a kind of a critical frame on society, a critical look on society that's about looking after oneself, and that naturalizes that as the only way to act. And so that's what I think is happening to people in Gen Z, whether it's through cryptocurrencies or whether it's through prediction markets or what have you.
That is a fascinating point, and I want to go deeper on that actually, because I think that's a really aligned point for my generation. Could you elaborate on that? Where does that kind of show up? Is that kind of like the professional gambler archetype that we're seeing, this ultra-capitalist kind of cultural deviant kind of like perspective where they want to just make money off of a society that's failing, and all they care about is their own kind of needs, as you put it. Where do we notice these people showing up, and why do you think they show up more prevalently now than before?
That's a great question. The it's a somewhat old study now. I don't have the date to much to hand, but the it has been shown that the desirability of becoming a professional gambler has gone up over several decades. This was done in the United States, if I remember rightly, um, and specifically amongst younger men in particular, right? And so the idea of the professional gambler, long kind of a romantic idea, also quite a kind of pro working class um, trope, is kind of belied by reality. Like we're the professional gamblers, and I do work with a few of them. Um, they are very often themselves quite data driven. They're often syndicated. They're often sponsored by other people. They're often highly kind of financialized and use a lot of their time consuming or working with data. They often live quite kind of precarious. They do a lot of screen work, right? It's not interesting. But once they've kind of worked through a formula, like there was one guy I talked to about who was currently his strategy at the time was on the number of red cards that you see during a game, right? And he built up a kind of system for working, and then he just had to apply it to like 15 games a day, and then hope that it was going to continue to make money for that month, right? So the idea of the professional gambler has become exalted, but the reality of the professional gambler has become, you know, datafied and financialized in a way that is that doesn't hold up to that kind of archetype. And what's happening at the same time is like, if you think about like Moneyball, or like even like Wolf of Wall Street, or there are lots of these kind of um Nate Silver is a great example of this kind of professional gambler turned kind of political statistician and model maker, and otherwise kind of information entrepreneur, data journalist. And there there are people like Nate Silver, and they are really brilliant people, but there is a kind of idea that those kind of individuals are going to create a kind of new world and a new set of insights that can be kind of that allow them to kind of cheat the system, to be the kind of professional gambler who does make it. But statistically, the numbers of the people who do that are really, really small. And but the idea that but the fact that all these people that anybody can have access to reams and reams of data that they wouldn't necessarily be able to kind of process or understand in the same way, or they can have access and they can subscribe to Nate Silver's models and so forth. Then it gives us the idea, with the kind of rise of data and the rise of digitalization, and the speed of social media and its kind of financial influences, it propagates the idea that if you can just work out how to be smart with it in a way that you're kind of, I've got two screens in front of me right now. Like you're doing the screen work that you have to do every day, but doing it in just the right way could somehow unlock a bunch of money. It's a really attractive idea that seems a lot less alien than going to 200 horse race meetings a year, as you would have had to have done to be a professional gambler 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think this kind of archetype really does show something about our society because I think it does show, like you mentioned, it's like the lack in trust of expertise. Like there's financial markets, and to look at the financial markets and go, actually, you guys are seeing something, you guys are missing something, and I'm going to figure what that is, and I'm going to make money off that. Like you mentioned, the Nate Silvers, the Wolf of Wall Street, so this world have popularized this movement. What I'm trying to understand is why do you think they came into being? Is it because of kind of the lack of trust in institutions that gives rise to these people, or do you think it's like our financial systems are built in a way which people at least can leech off it?
Sorry, can you clarify that question a little bit?
I'm
Are we
trying to.
talking about the Nate Silvers of the world and how they rose? So what are you saying?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. How do you think they came into being? What do you think gave rise to what opportunity are they kind of making use of?
Well, I think that in back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and a bit on from that really, the idea that you could kind of use Bayesian reasoning, that you could work, you could you could piggyback on the release of data over Twitter, the way that you could kind of exploit gaps in the way that odds are kind of adjusted over time. Those kind of, and there were big successes like on that. Loads of people making lots of money on Barack Obama winning the nomination, for instance, or famously on Leave winning the referendum. Um, the those those gaps in understanding, um, and the kind of uh, and the financial opportunities that those that gave rise to, those have been very quickly swallowed up, if not swallowed up by um, the individuals who are profiting on it. Then also by the gambling industry or the other kind of financial providers that we've been talking about, kind of making sure that in the kind of data war, as they can possibly be. So it's that there was a moment when it was much more possible than it is today, and the dream or the idea that it's possible to do it in the present is a kind of hangover of that, but also something that's kind of continually kind of can be imaginatively put out there as something that you could do in the future. So because you can become a financial influencer on TikTok or what have you, and you can kind of you can push this idea on people that if you could just act like you could just follow these few rules, you'll potentially make money just like I did. Well, then when people follow that and it's unsuccessful, who do they blame? They blame themselves because they didn't follow the right person, or they didn't act quickly enough, or they weren't able to kind of mobilize their relationships in a way that was able to make their side hustle into their kind of passive income, right? That it's the selling of that possibility has become an industry in itself. And so there's always been kind of snake oil salesmen out there, but these days the idea of financial independence is a big kind of vat of snake oil that can be kind of infinitely reproduced, because you don't really have to provide any evidence that you are making that money yourself. And indeed, if you were making that money, why are you making TikTok videos about how to make that money? um, so yeah, I mean, people can just make money on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think you see it so prevalently. If you, like you mentioned, the TikTok videos, you see people making money on literally anything, whether it rain, what the president is going to say, all these kind of like different possibilities. I want to now take a step back and look at the political and the cultural now and how this kind of plays a part into this. And the first of the political, right? I'm seeing more and more people engage in this politically, like we were saying, betting on elections, betting on like referendums, just making being on the face of it, more politically engaged because they have to make these bets. But I'm wondering, what is the outcome of this? When someone places a bet on a political kind of event, right? Does that mean they're more engaged in politics or they're less engaged in politics? What do you think?
I mean, it could be. It's sort of, it's almost like a bell curve, right? You're kind of you it shows an interest in politics, but once you get beyond a certain level of engagement with it, then you're really kind of im impoverishing your understanding of politics by treating it as just a way of potentially working out what's going to happen in the future. I've heard lots of people in the political gambling space say that the smartest people are the ones who are able to predict what's going to happen in the future, right? And there's a certain logic to that. It makes a lot of sense, but it's not visionary. It's not. It doesn't. It's pragmatism as an ideology, and I think that if you think about the really successful kind of people who engage with politics, they they grab it by the scruff of their neck and they make their own visions and narratives and turn them into things that people can participate in. And if you think about engagement in politics in terms of you know uh, activists being having discussions about how to organize, or Labour Party politicians working out how to kind of engage more with people on the doorstep, right? That is it, it's an engagement with purpose, and uh, and the gambling part of it just kind of detracts from the otherwise purposeful engagement with politics that might be going on. I'm not I'm not like diametrically opposed to gambling on politics. Not at all really. But uh we the idea that it represents some kind of sort of wizardly brilliant sort of way to think about how politics should be conducted. It's not really what I've found. I found that people who engage with it very often wrong, and they're just faster at correcting
Hmm.
and getting on the profitable side of things. They very often have kind of quite strange understandings about what they think is going to happen, and often it they people aren't as they they think about it as a game and are often kind of not politically aligned. They're the kind of people who are more interested in competence above policy. Um, and I think we need some of those people in this world, but the idea that everybody should be that kind of person, I think would reduces our collective political acumen. And what we could do with a lot more of is people engaging in the kind of like deliberate argumentation and exploration of different ideas rather than trying to kind of distance oneself from it and only think about the way that you can kind of predict a kind of ever worsening reality.
Yeah, you mentioned gamifying politics, and I think that's so true because I see that prevalent in my generation. It's kind of like split into two camps. The camp of like on the left, kind of like generally who kind of want change and want to protest, and kind of on the right also generally who kind of want to kind of make use of what's happening in politics and kind of are cynical about the outcomes and say, you know what, if I can't help it, I might as well make money off it. And those two camps are binding each other because the other seeds are that's almost ridiculous. I think that culture of people who don't look at politics as something to be engaged in or something that we should take accountability for, but as something that's outside of yourself that you can either make money of or you can criticize in a different way and look at or intellectually kind of misses the point almost.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I completely agree. And it's you can't. It's difficult to blame. well, I wouldn't blame Gen Z people for acting like that, because it's been a cascade of failure to see change enacted, or to kind of rub up against the kind of an institutionalism and an inertia that means that I'm 41. I think it's almost all disappointments in politics since I started, but since I became interested in it. It seems and in the world where we our politicians have less power to do things, we looking to try and make kind of radical changes and things. It's it's sad it's sad that the kind of growing way of engaging with politics is one that deliberately stands on the kind of sidelines of thinking about it. But the other thing I have to say about it is that it's gambling on politics is the smell of fresh bread as you walk into the supermarket. There, it's interesting. It's cultures on the line. It's the reason I'm studying it, but it is not where they make their money. Some of them, your cultures and poly markets, they might be able to work at scale, but even those ones will be, they're trying to move into other financial markets as much as possible. There's the the getting engaged in political gambling is seen as a pathway into people engaging in other forms of gambling, and the more forms of gambling that you engage in, the higher the likelihood of losses. um and once you've got money in a wallet, in an account, it's very easy for that money to then be shifted out, because there's no politics going on this week. I'm instead, and the football season is over. Well, let's try one of these online slots, and then then money it's like it's like a metronome of losing money after that. So we shouldn't overestimate their kind of financial and cultural importance, but we should recognize that they have a kind of they have a power to entice and to bring a kind of engagement with people, but people don't have the time to understand it as well enough to really make money from it, potentially, or they just don't have that faculty in them anyway. And not everyone can make money on them, and the people who have more money to put into them, they can more easily kind of mop up money uh, in political gambling markets. And once those people are kind of engaged and on the website, it's very easy to convert them into other kinds of gamblers where there is lots and lots of money to be made, um, and your chances of making it are much lower.
Yeah, no, I feel like, yeah, I think looking at it like from the outside, it just kind of seems like it's a kind of a trend, and it seems that the trend is going to keep on going. The kind of the pipeline that you discovered, you just kind of talked about. It starts from like even like Klarna, even like buy now, pay later, and then Venmo transactions, and all these different ways and systems that like these financial slash gambling systems are kind of pervasive in our life and our culture, which is kind of innocuous and innocent from the offset, almost there to help you. But I think once it becomes so kind of pervasive in our culture, we don't even realize this is intent. We don't even see it as gambling. We kind of see it as kind of like a financial system. To kind of to talk about that point a bit, I currently the UK kind of makes a distinction between gambling and finance, but more than the US at least. Do you think that distinction is important?
Yeah, I think it's massively important for um, protecting the integrity of our financial system, and protecting people from other kinds of gambling, current events gambling, or basically, if you there are certain kind of safeguards that are put on place because it's a harmful a commercial activity gambling, um, it makes it, we put on certain guardrails. I would argue that those guardrails need to be stronger, but nevertheless, if you treat it as gambling, then then those guardrails remain in place. Those adverts that tell you to stop. The fact that it's kind of uh, presented to you on a specific site that doesn't also offer you loans, that doesn't, that isn't also where your ISA is, right? Um, that is massively important to prevent the blurring of boundaries, because at the end of the day, gambling on politics and gambling and kind of day trading or investment is is kind of an artificial boundary, right? But um, that doesn't, just because it's artificial doesn't mean that it's not important, right? We need to protect those. We need to protect it, a, for the integrity of the outcomes of those events, and the perceived integrity of those outcomes, but also to protect people from feeling like it's all a gamble anyway, right? Because the idea that it's all a gamble anyway is uh you know gives people much less of a stake in being sensible about their finances, but also it makes the kind of pernicious or controlling, or just kind of having large leverage over the market so that you can make money whilst other people are unable to, it naturalizes that. And that's a major problem if we're going to protect our system. But it is going to be a major challenge with crypto, and with the fact that you can get round kind of national boundaries using it, and also potentially any kind of political pressure that gets put on people in the as we reform the gambling sector. But I should say that there have been changes to the way that kind of gambling uh, prevention and harm reduction and research has changed in Britain over the last couple of years. And that's leading to a bunch of new research, which I'm also part of, that hopefully is going to mean that we take a more kind of um, a less industry friendly approach to regulating gambling, but also a clearer approach to regulating the boundaries of what is gambling and what isn't gambling in the future. And I think that in some ways the kind of momentum for that is shifting. It's it's a bit frightening what's happening on the kind of political gambling prediction market side, but on the other side, the kind of crypto side, then I think a kind of a larger understanding of the lack of utility of crypto and its relationship to gambling is making it easier for regulators and to put up boundaries around it, right? The use case has not really emerged
Mm,
outside of facilitating current events gambling,
mhm,
and so it's going to be more possible for us to kind of put those things in the kind of gambling camp, and potentially provide better kind of safeguards and regulations against them.
mm. And coming back to kind of the study in Papua New Guinea that we were talking about, and kind of linking it to this conversation we're just having now, when you were in Papua New Guinea, you witnessed marginalized communities using gambling as a form of hope. And now you look at, for example, a 25-year-old in Manchester using Cashi or Poly Market as a way to get out of their own economic kind of system or their economic background. Um, do you feel a distinction between those two? Do you think there's the same phenomena? What do you see when you look at what's happening in Papua New Guinea and also what's happening here?
That's another good question. I think it's tricky for me to answer that because I haven't been back to Papua New Guinea since 2019. Um, my In some ways they're really similar, because there's a lack of understanding of what people are getting into when it comes to forms of gambling that have a kind of have a house edge built into them, or that are kind of controlled um by wealth. And and uh, and that's kind of mirrored over here, and there's kind of active ways to kind of obfuscate that understanding. But I think that in some ways it's quite different too, because people can just play cards with each other. That is kind of still the primary way that people gamble with each other. Those forms of gambling involve lots. They make money public, and they make money public in a way that sort of greases the wheels of sharing, whether it's cigarettes or something called betel nut that they chew there, or sugar and noodles and cups of tea, and provides a kind of replacement to the kind of nighttime storytelling and guard duty and things that preoccupy people before colonization. And they it does they are part of kind of community building, whereas I think in the UK, and elsewhere, it's more pernicious, because it's on your phone, because you do it in the loo, because you do it, you don't mention it to your friend whilst you're doing it as in the pub. Um, it's and all of those opportunities are ones that are where the odds are not in your favor as a rule. And so it's more, it doesn't perform the social function that you can make a case for it performing in Papua New Guinea. It is too tightly controlled, and it's too uh it's too kind of bound up in a a rigid politics of capitalism, that I think is just whilst people in Papua New Guinea are very often kind of impoverished, and they're on the real periphery of global economy. um they can still just survive without money for a month on crops in their garden. In many of them, um, they can still kind of just go and participate in and hang around with people while they're playing cards or gambling with other people. It here Gambling as a social act is overblown in terms of how we actually interact with it for the most part, and increasingly, and where the kind of new profits are to be gained, that's from engaging with people who are who are gambling at 4 o'clock in the morning, having just woken up.
That's a terrible, yeah, terrible image. But I think, yeah, I think it says a lot about kind of the economies of these countries, right? The UK and the US, that, like in parts of the world, in Papua New Guinea, for example, even in Ghana, where I'm from, gambling is seen as a way to escape, kind of financial oppression, kind of economic mobility. Well, while it's here, even though the need isn't that big to actually do this, there wants the demand for it, kind of the like you said, 4 a.m. gambling in the morning is part of it. It's just habitual almost, here, rather than kind of like necessary. It makes me think about what that says about the state of these economies. If gambling increases in economies where economic mobility is closed, and we're living in our kind of in this kind of climate, what does that say about kind of our economy right now?
Well, nothing good. But but we should also be clear that this is a change that happened, um, because of the liberalization of gambling during the New Labour period, in 2005. Reform and the fact that change was brought in the same year, but with but without the knowledge of smartphones and what they meant for the way that we gamble and and the opportunities that are available for people to do it. And so we there are many different ways of approaching gambling regulation, and you see them in lots and lots of different countries. Um, so we have liberalized this on purpose. It's now become the case that we we've we've sort of entrenched the idea that this is some kind of inevitable uh, uh, thing that that's been unleashed but was always kind of latent. But we've been taught to engage in gambling in all the ways that we've talked about already. So it's not, I would say, this isn't inevitable, but it is, but it's hard to but it needs addressing if you're ever going to address the larger kind of systemic problems in our economy and uh, in the kind of society that we're making for our young people, and for the jobs that we're hoping to kind of create and the lives that we want to make people live. Because if we teach people that gambling and finance have no boundaries between them, and that you should be engaging with it because you have no other options, um, and because it's sort of an acceptable and available product that can be brought to you, and that's been kind of trained into you through the way that you've been engaging with loot boxes when you were a kid, and all the adverts that you've seen and all the football shirts that you've seen, etc. Then you are creating that as a culture. And I think the really dangerous thing is the acceptance of the kind of the spirit of gambling to uh, as a zeitgeist for right now. If we start to think about a gambling spirit as being kind of uh, uh, necessary and part of how we should think about the world, when we exalt CEOs for the way that they kind of leverage buyouts, or that they or the ways that they have taken risks on companies. Often those risks are the risk of that is overblown in the telling. But when we kind of exalt all of these figures in all different directions, and we kind of facilitate that by thinking about things as gambling all the time, that kind of facilitates us to make analogies across all these different parts of our society. Then we give that approach to life a coherence that I don't think that we should encourage, and I don't think is reflective of reality as people should live it.
Final few questions then.
Yeah.
You spend your career studying how people bet on the future, and especially when the present feels close. Has that made you feel more hopeful or less hopeful about our economic future, personally?
Oh, that's yeah. I'm not very hopeful. Um, I I would like I don't think that outside of any kind of larger structural changes, revolts, different forms of governance, different actual governments, um, I I and without some stop being put on the kind of export of this of this way of doing things from the US. um, I don't see much of a way of doing it. I mean, of getting past it into a fairer and more just world. I think that um, I think that there are, the world could be better, could be more hopeful. There will still be successes. There'll be people will still be okay. Allotments will still be things that people can go to and plant their carrots and harvest their garlic. But um, we need fundamental changes to just about everything, and we need to disempower a lot of people who have too much power right now, and we need to do that as part of a larger vision. And what makes me unhopeful is the failure to actually um, articulate anything that remotely looks like a positive vision. I hope that I'll see it, and I'll do whatever I can for it. But I haven't seen it for a while.
Yeah, I mean the work that you're doing is very important. I think even this conversation, I think a lot of people don't have an idea about these systems. These systems are clouded in mystery, and the incentives are also clouded in mystery. But when you have the studies that you do and the work that you do to kind of articulate that, it gives people a tool to understand that, and then I feel like change comes afterwards. I think my generation, my audience is Gen Z. And I'm always trying to speak to them about like the systems that are happening around us and how we understand it, because it just feels like these systems were done before we even have time to understand them. So on that final point, then, what would you say to a young person who feels like the conventional path of making money is kind of close to them, and gambling seems like the only way? That kind of the example we gave before about a 25-year-old living in Manchester. What would you say to him about kind of how to approach the future?
Oh, well, first of all, it's very kind of you to say those things, despite their lack of veracity. But but to answer your actual question, um, what I would say is that there aren't any kind of easy answers to how you should find a way of making money, and certainly in the current situation, a bit of entrepreneurialism is required of everybody, um, but don't allow it to become your to become an ideology, right? Because it's a thing you do in order to get by, and you keep an eye on the bigger picture, if you can. And if when it comes to it, the numbers are in on the gambling, and while political gambling is one where the numbers are slightly better than other forms of gambling, it's very unlikely uh, to be a stable source of income, and it wouldn't be a stable one to begin with, but it would, but as a kind of as a source of income, and one that you could kind of base yourself on. It you're talking The general estimate is about 3% of gamblers, and that's among 3% of gamblers who gamble on things that uh, give you a chance to be profitable, like horses, like football, etc. Um, and you got to keep that in your mind. Do you think that you're one of those 3%? And even if you are among those that 3%, can you maintain it when you are faced with um, continual incentives to gamble on other things? How disciplined are you really in your engagement with it? um, Keep records. If you're in it already, keep records and work out what you're doing. That's what all the successful ones tell me. And be honest with yourself. If it's not working, do something different. um and uh and as a general piece of advice, I would steer clear.
Thank you. That's fantastic advice all around. Yeah, this has been a very enlightening and amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight throughout this conversation. Is there Where can they find you? People watching want to see more of your work. Are you available online anywhere that they can find you?
um I've retreated from social media. People can find me on the University of Birmingham website, where you can find a way of reaching me directly. And I'm working on a book on political gambling right now. Not sure when it's going to come out. Um, but me and my my team are working on some kind of policy recommendations on political gambling and on cryptocurrency gambling over the coming months. So, just search my name.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the book and the insight in that too. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Anthony Pickles. See you next time. Thank
See you
you.
again. Thanks.